I never imagined that my life, which I thought was built on the strongest foundation of love and trust, would start crumbling in such a catastrophic way. My name is James, and I had been married to Evelyn for 12 years. Ours was a relationship rooted in faith and community, centered around our shared involvement in our local church. Evelyn was everything to me. My partner, my confidant, and my guiding star. Or so I believed. It all started innocuously enough. Evelyn began volunteering more with the church's outreach programs, inspired, as she said, by the words and charisma of Pastor Elijah, our congregation's dynamic young leader. Elijah had arrived in our community 2 years ago, transforming our church with his impassioned sermons and seemingly boundless energy. His ability to connect with people was unmatched, and Evelyn was one of many drawn into his orbit. At first, I didn't think much of it. Evelyn's commitment to the church had always been strong, and she found great joy in being part of something bigger than herself. But soon, her involvement began to feel different. Her once overflowing affection toward me turned into fleeting kisses and distracted conversations. The laughter that filled our evenings grew quiet, replaced by her recounting of Pastor Elijah's latest teachings. One evening, I brought it up. "You've been spending a lot of time at the church?" I said casually as we cleared the dinner table. She paused, her hands tightening around a plate. "There's just so much work to be done, James. Elijah has this incredible vision for the community. I want to support him." Her words were innocent enough, but something in her tone made me uneasy. "You mean the church's vision, right?" I asked, half joking. She laughed, brushing my comment off. "Of course." Yet, as the weeks went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing her. Not to work, but to something or someone else. One night, when she thought I was asleep, I overheard her on the phone. Her voice, usually warm and soft, was trembling with excitement. "Thank you, Elijah. You always know the right thing to say," she whispered, her tone carrying an intimacy that didn't belong in a conversation with our pastor. I lay there, frozen, a cold knot tightening in my chest. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was just grateful for his guidance, but doubt gnawed at me. From that moment on, I couldn't look at Evelyn the same way. Every late-night text, every extra hour at the church, every mention of Elijah in her conversations seemed like another crack in the life we had built together. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of the unraveling. The seed of suspicion had taken root, and no matter how much I tried to push it aside, it grew relentlessly. I told myself I was overreacting. Evelyn and I had always been open and trusting with one another. Yet, the more I observed, the harder it was to ignore the subtle changes in her behavior. She started dressing differently, modestly, but with a newfound flair. She always looked beautiful to me, but lately her attention to her appearance seemed almost deliberate, like she was preparing for an audience. I'd catch glimpses of her reflection in the mirror as she adjusted her hair or reapplied her lipstick before leaving for another evening meeting at the church. One Sunday morning after service, I decided to talk to someone about my growing concerns. I sought out Peter, a friend and fellow member of the congregation. Peter had been part of the church much longer than I had and was someone I trusted. "Peter," I started hesitantly as we sipped coffee in the church's courtyard. "Do you think Evelyn's been overly dedicated to Pastor Elijah's work lately?" Peter raised an eyebrow, his weathered face softening with concern. "She's always been passionate about her faith. Are you worried about her?" I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "I just feel like maybe she's too involved. She's at the church more than she's at home these days." Peter set his cup down, leaning in closer. "James, Elijah has a way of drawing people in. But if something feels off, trust your gut. Talk to Evelyn. Don't let doubt fester." His advice was sound, but I couldn't bring myself to confront her yet. Instead, I started paying closer attention. One night, while she was in the shower, I noticed her phone vibrating on the dresser. A text message lit up the screen, the sender labeled simply as E. My stomach churned as I glanced at the message. "Tonight was beautiful. You inspire me in ways words can't express." I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. Could mean anything, I told myself. but paired with everything else, it felt like a cipher I was too afraid to decode. When Evelyn emerged from the bathroom, her cheeks flushed from the heat, I tried to act normal. "Hey," I said casually, "I noticed your phone buzzing. Someone trying to reach you." Her eyes darted to the phone, and for a moment, I thought I saw panic flicker across her face. But she recovered quickly, giving me a soft smile. "Oh, it's just Elijah. He's been sharing some ideas about the new community program." "At this hour?" I asked, my voice betraying a hint of skepticism. She shrugged, avoiding my gaze. "You know how passionate he is." I wanted to press further, to demand answers, but the fear of what I might uncover held me back. Instead, I nodded and forced a smile, letting her believe I was satisfied with her response. But I wasn't. The next morning, I decided to take action. If Evelyn wouldn't tell me what was going on, I would have to find out for myself. I arrived at the church earlier than usual, hoping to catch Elijah alone before the day's activities began. The sanctuary was quiet, the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows casting vibrant patterns on the pews. I found him in his office, seated behind a desk cluttered with books and papers. "James!" he greeted me warmly, rising to shake my hand. What a pleasant surprise. I forced a smile, trying to mask the storm brewing inside me. "Elijah, I wanted to talk to you about Evelyn." His expression shifted subtly, a guarded look replacing his usual charm. "Is everything all right? She's been spending a lot of time here lately." I began, choosing my words carefully. "I just want to make sure she's not overextending herself." Elijah leaned back in his chair, a serene smile spreading across his face. "Your wife has a beautiful soul, James. Her dedication is inspiring. She's been an invaluable part of our mission." "That's good to hear," I said, though his words did little to ease my unease. "But if you notice her taking on too much, let me know. I don't want her burning out." "Of course," Elijah replied smoothly. But as I left his office, I couldn't shake the feeling that his reassurances were as hollow as my attempts to convince myself there was nothing to worry about. The tension between Evelyn and me continued to build, though neither of us acknowledged it. We danced around the elephant in the room, our conversations polite but distant. It was as if we were playing roles in a script we hadn't agreed to. My suspicions boiled over when Evelyn informed me she'd be spending a weekend at the church retreat center with a group of volunteers. "Elijah wants to focus on the planning for the youth mentorship program," she explained as she packed her bags. The weekend away sounded innocent enough, but her excitement seemed almost too enthusiastic. She was glowing as she carefully folded her clothes, her energy reminiscent of someone preparing for a romantic getaway rather than a church retreat. That Saturday, I drove her to the retreat center. It was a secluded property surrounded by towering trees, its rustic charm belying the undercurrent of unease I felt. As she unloaded her bags, Elijah appeared, greeting us with his usual warm smile. "James, good to see you," he said, extending a hand. "You should join us one day. These weekends are a great way to connect with the spirit." "Maybe next time," I replied, forcing a smile. But my eyes lingered on the way his hand rested on Evelyn's shoulder, just a beat too long. She didn't seem to notice, or maybe she didn't want me to notice. The drive home was a blur. I couldn't shake the nagging thought that something was deeply wrong. The next day, unable to sit idly by, I decided to return to the retreat center unannounced. If there was nothing to find, I'd be relieved. But if there was something... As I arrived, I parked my car at the edge of the property and quietly made my way through the wooded path toward the main building. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I'd find Evelyn surrounded by volunteers brainstorming ideas for the youth program. Instead, what I saw confirmed my worst fears. Through the large windows of the retreat center, I spotted Evelyn and Elijah in the dimly lit common room. They weren't discussing program logistics. They weren't even sitting at opposite ends of the room. They were alone, huddled together on a couch, their faces close. Too close. I felt like the air had been punched out of my lungs as I watched her hand graze his cheek, his arm wrapping around her waist. They moved like people who had crossed lines long ago, comfortable in their betrayal. My first instinct was to storm in, to demand answers, to drag Evelyn out of there and confront her for shattering the trust we'd built over 12 years. But something stopped me. A mix of shock, heartbreak, and, perhaps, the desire to fully understand the scope of what was happening. Instead, I backed away, retreating to my car with a silent promise to myself. I would not let this go unanswered. That evening, Evelyn returned home, her demeanor calm, her smile sweet. "The retreat was so productive," she said as she placed her bag by the door. "Elijah has such a clear vision for the program." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "I'm glad to hear that." She leaned in to kiss my cheek, but I turned away, pretending to check my phone. Her brow furrowed slightly, but she said nothing. If she suspected I knew something, she didn't show it. As she disappeared into the kitchen, I stared at the photo of us hanging on the wall. A smiling couple on our wedding day, full of hope and love. It felt like a relic of a life that no longer existed. The days following the retreat were unbearable. Evelyn seemed oblivious to my simmering anger and growing detachment, or maybe she was just pretending not to notice. Either way, I couldn't confront her. Not yet. I needed proof, something undeniable, to ensure that when I finally spoke up, there would be no room for lies or gaslighting. I started digging. That Monday morning, after Evelyn left for work, I opened her laptop. It was a shared device, but she rarely used it for anything other than checking emails. As I navigated to her inbox, my hands trembled with a mix of guilt and determination. What I found shocked me. There were emails from Elijah. Most were harmless on the surface, discussions about church projects, volunteer schedules, and community events. But as I scrolled further, the tone began to shift. One email in particular stopped me cold. "Evelyn, your faith inspires me in ways I never thought possible. Last weekend was a reminder of how deeply connected we are, not just spiritually, but on every level. You are truly a gift in my life." The knot in my stomach tightened as I read and reread the words. I knew they could be interpreted innocently, but paired with what I'd seen at the retreat center, there was no mistaking their meaning. I took screenshots of the emails and sent them to myself. Then I checked her calendar app. There, I noticed several meetings blocked off during times when she'd said she was running errands or staying late at work. I noted the locations and times. Small breadcrumbs leading me closer to the truth. That evening, Evelyn was unusually cheerful. She made my favorite meal and suggested we watch one of our old favorite movies. It was almost as if she were trying to reconnect with me, or maybe to assuage her own guilt. But I couldn't enjoy it. I sat stiffly on the couch, her laughter grating against the chaos in my mind. "James, are you okay?" she asked, placing a hand on my arm. "Yeah," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired." She studied me for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly, but she didn't press further. The next day, I called a private investigator. Felt like a betrayal of my own, hiring someone to spy on my wife. But the thought of confronting Evelyn without irrefutable evidence terrified me. I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. The PI's name was Marcus. He was a no-nonsense man in his late 50s with a calm demeanor that instantly put me at ease. After explaining my suspicions, he nodded thoughtfully. "I'll start immediately," he said. "If there's something to find, I'll find it." Over the next week, I played the part of the unsuspecting husband. I smiled when Evelyn shared updates about church events, nodded along as she described her meetings with Elijah, and even kissed her goodnight as if nothing had changed. Inside, I was crumbling. One evening, as we sat at the dinner table, Evelyn's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her lips curving into a soft smile before she quickly put it face down on the table. "Who's that?" I asked casually, though my voice felt heavy with accusation. "Just a message from the church group," she said, not meeting my eyes. My jaw tightened, but I said nothing. The following morning, Marcus called. "We've got something," he said. My heart raced as he explained what he had uncovered. A meeting between Evelyn and Elijah at a nearby cafe, their body language more intimate than professional. He promised to send photos and a detailed report. When the email arrived later that afternoon, I opened it with trembling hands. The photos showed Evelyn and Elijah sitting close together, their heads nearly touching as they spoke. In one image, Elijah's hand rested on hers across the table. My world collapsed around me. There was no denying it now. I closed my laptop and sat in silence, staring at the wall. The love of my life, the woman I trusted above all else, was betraying me. And the man she was doing it with, the man who had stood at the pulpit and preached about trust, fidelity, and faith, was someone I'd once respected. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was spiritual. I knew what I had to do next. The evidence burned a hole in my mind, occupying every thought as I planned my next move. There was no avoiding it anymore. I had to confront Evelyn. That evening, she came home later than usual, her cheeks flushed and her smile radiant. "Sorry I'm late," she said, setting her purse on the kitchen counter. The meeting ran long, but we made such great progress on the youth program. I watched her, every word cutting into me like a blade. The woman I loved stood before me, lying so effortlessly. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady but firm. Her smile faltered. "Of course. What's on your mind?" "Let's sit down," I said, motioning toward the living room. She hesitated, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite place. Concern? Fear? Maybe both. She followed me and perched on the edge of the couch, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Evelyn," I began, choosing my words carefully. "I've been feeling distant from you lately, like something's changed between us." Her brow furrowed, and she reached for my hand. "James, I've been so busy with church. I know I haven't been around as much, but it's nothing personal. You know how much this work means to me." Her words were like a rehearsed script, but I wasn't buying it. "It's not just the time you've been spending away," I said, pulling my hand back. "It's the way you've been acting. And it's not just with me. It's with Elijah." Her eyes widened, and a flush crept up her neck. "Elijah?" she echoed, her voice tinged with surprise. "What about him?" "I know, Evelyn." I kept my tone even, though my chest was tight with emotion. "I know about the emails, the meetings, the retreat." Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked like a deer caught in headlights. "I hired a private investigator," I continued, watching her closely. "I have photos of you and Elijah together, holding hands, sitting too close, smiling at each other like lovers." Her face drained of color, and for a moment, she looked like she might faint. "James, I can explain," she whispered. "Then explain," I said, leaning forward, my voice harder now. "Tell me why the woman I've loved for 12 years is sneaking around with another man. Our pastor, of all people." Tears welled up in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks. "It's not what you think," she said shakily. "Elijah and we've been close because he's helped me so much. I was struggling, James. I felt lost. Lost," I repeated, my voice rising. "So you turned to him? Instead of me? Your husband." "It wasn't supposed to happen," she sobbed. "We didn't mean for it to go this far." Her words confirmed what I already knew, but hearing them out loud shattered something inside me. "How far has it gone, Evelyn?" I demanded. "Don't lie to me." She buried her face in her hands, her body shaking with sobs. "It wasn't just emotional," she admitted, her voice muffled. "It became physical. But only once. I swear." I stood, unable to sit still any longer. My fists clenched at my sides as anger and heartbreak warred within me. "You betrayed me," I said, my voice trembling. "You betrayed our vows, our faith, everything we built together." "I'm sorry," she cried, reaching for me. "James, please, I love you. I made a mistake, but I love you." I stepped back, out of her reach. "You don't get to say that now," I said coldly. "Not after what you've done." Her sobs filled the room, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. "Not this time. I need time to think," I said, turning toward the door. "Don't follow me. Don't call me. I'll decide what happens next." I walked out, leaving her alone with her guilt and the broken pieces of our marriage. I drove aimlessly for hours, the city blurring into a haze of lights and shadows as I wrestled with the storm of emotions inside me. Anger, heartbreak, humiliation. They all churned together, threatening to pull me under. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Evelyn's tear-streaked face, heard her broken confession, and felt the crushing weight of betrayal all over again. Eventually, I parked at the edge of a quiet park and sat there in the darkness, trying to make sense of it all. How had we ended up here? What had I missed? Could I have done something differently to prevent this? The questions had no answers, only echoes of doubt. I thought about our marriage, the years we'd spent building a life together. Every moment felt tainted now, every memory overshadowed by what I'd discovered. Yet, a part of me still clung to the hope that this was salvageable, that we could somehow piece together the shattered fragments of our life. But then there was Elijah. The thought of him, the man I had trusted, the man who had counseled me on faith and love, stirred a fresh wave of anger. How dare he position himself as a moral authority while violating the sanctity of my marriage? How many others had fallen victim to his charm and charisma under the guise of spiritual guidance? I wasn't just furious with him. I was furious with myself for not seeing through him sooner. By the time I returned home, it was well past midnight. The house was dark, and Evelyn was asleep on the couch, her face swollen from crying. I didn't wake her. Instead, I went upstairs to our bedroom and closed the door, needing the space to breathe. The next morning, I called Marcus, the private investigator, and asked him to dig deeper into Elijah. I want everything, I told him. His history, his connections, his secrets. If he's done this to me, I want to know if he's done it to others. Marcus didn't ask questions. He simply promised to get to work. Later that day, I sat down with my closest friend, Peter, the same man I'd confided in weeks earlier. Over cups of black coffee at his kitchen table, I laid everything out. Evelyn's confession, the evidence, the betrayal. Peter listened intently, his expression a mix of sympathy and quiet rage. "James," he said finally, setting his cup down with a thud. "I've had my doubts about Elijah for a while. The way he gets close to women in the congregation, it's not right. You're not the first person to feel uneasy about him." "What do you mean?" I asked, my pulse quickening. Peter hesitated, as if weighing his next words carefully. "There were whispers about him at his last church. Something about an inappropriate relationship with another member's wife. But nothing was ever proven. He left under unclear circumstances." The pieces began to fall into place, each one sharpening my anger. Elijah wasn't just a man who had betrayed my trust. He was a predator cloaked in the robes of a pastor. "What do I do, Peter?" I asked, my voice heavy with despair. Peter leaned forward, his eyes hard with determination. "You expose him, James. You bring this to light. If he's done this to you, who knows how many others he's hurt. People deserve to know the truth." His words struck a chord deep within me. I had been so consumed with my personal pain that I hadn't considered the broader implications of Elijah's actions. This wasn't just about my marriage. It was about the community, the faith we had all placed in a man who didn't deserve it. As I left Peter's house, a plan began to form in my mind. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The more I thought about it, the more resolute I became. Elijah's actions had not only betrayed my marriage, but also the trust of an entire community. If I stayed silent, I would be complicit in allowing him to continue his manipulations. This wasn't just personal, it was a moral obligation. The first step was gathering evidence. The emails, the photos, Evelyn's confession. I had enough to paint a damning picture, but I needed more. If Elijah had a pattern of behavior, it had to be brought to light. 2 days later, Marcus called with an update. "James, you're not going to like this," he said, his voice heavy. "What is it?" I asked, bracing myself. "Elijah has a history. I found records from 2 previous churches. Both times, he left abruptly after rumors of inappropriate relationships. Nothing ever went public, though. Probably because the victims were too afraid or ashamed to speak out. My grip on the phone tightened. Do you have names? Marcus hesitated. I do, but you'll need to approach them carefully. They've been through a lot. I'll be careful, I promised. Over the next few days, I reached out to the women Marcus had identified. Some didn't respond, while others refused to talk. But one woman, Rachel, agreed to meet. We met at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. Rachel was in her early 30s, with tired eyes that spoke of battles fought and scars left behind. I'm not surprised you're here, she said as she stirred her coffee. Elijah has a way of getting under people's skin. He knows exactly how to make you feel seen, like you're the only person who matters. And then he uses that to his advantage. I listened as she recounted her story. A relationship that began with spiritual guidance and devolved into something manipulative and toxic. When the rumors started, Elijah left, leaving her to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. I wanted to speak up, Rachel said, her voice trembling, but I was too scared. He's so charismatic, so convincing. I didn't think anyone would believe me. They will now, I assured her. You're not alone in this. With Rachel's testimony, the puzzle became clearer. Elijah's pattern wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. He used his position to exploit vulnerable people, hiding behind the facade of a man of God. That Sunday I went to church. It felt surreal, sitting in the pews as Elijah delivered his sermon. His words dripped with sincerity, his tone impassioned. I could see why so many were drawn to him, but all I could think about were the lies he had told, the lives he had wrecked. After the service, I approached him. Elijah, can we talk? Of course, James, he said, his smile as polished as ever. We stepped into his office, and I closed the door behind us. For a moment, I simply stared at him, my anger simmering beneath the surface. What's on your mind? He asked, leaning back in his chair. I know what you've been doing, I said, my voice low and steady. His smile faltered, a flicker of something, panic, perhaps, crossing his face. I'm not sure I follow. Don't play dumb, I said, stepping closer. I know about Evelyn. I know about Rachel. I know about the other churches. He stood, his demeanor shifting from calm to defensive. James, whatever you've heard, save it, I snapped. You've built a career on lies and manipulation, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it. Elijah's face hardened. Be careful, James, he said, his voice dropping. You don't want to do something you'll regret. I already regret trusting you, I shot back. But I won't regret exposing the truth. I turned and walked out, my heart pounding. This was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was in control. After my confrontation with Elijah, I knew there was no turning back. I had crossed the line from betrayed husband to whistleblower, and I was determined to follow through. That night, I compiled everything. The photos, the emails, Rachel's testimony, and the records Marcus had uncovered. I organized it into a clear, concise document, leaving no room for doubt about Elijah's actions. The next step was to bring this to the attention of the church leadership. It wasn't an easy decision. I knew the fallout would be immense. Elijah had built a devoted following, and his charisma had won over even the most skeptical members of the congregation. But the truth had to come out. On Monday evening, I requested a private meeting with the church council. The room was tense as I sat before them, the folder of evidence in my lap. These were people I respected, people I had prayed with and shared meals with. But as I began to speak, their expressions shifted from confusion to shock. Elijah has betrayed this community, I said, my voice steady despite the weight of my words. He has used his position to manipulate and exploit, and I have the proof. I laid out the evidence, piece by piece, watching as their disbelief turned to anger. The photos of Evelyn and Elijah were damning enough, but the testimonies from Rachel and others solidified the case. By the time I finished, the room was silent, the gravity of the situation sinking in. We need to act on this immediately, one of the elders said, breaking the silence. If even half of this is true, Elijah has no place in this church. Another elder nodded. We have to notify the congregation. This isn't something we can sweep under the rug. The council agreed to hold an emergency meeting the following Sunday, where the evidence would be presented to the entire congregation. It was a decision I supported, though I dreaded the chaos it would undoubtedly unleash. The days leading up to the meeting were a blur. Evelyn and I barely spoke, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. She knew I was taking action against Elijah, and while she didn't try to stop me, her guilt was palpable. I caught her crying more than once, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. The betrayal was still too raw. When Sunday arrived, the church was packed. Word of the emergency meeting had spread, and nearly every member of the congregation was in attendance. I sat near the back, my heart pounding as the council stepped forward to address the crowd. The head elder began, his voice steady but somber. We have called this meeting to address a serious matter concerning Pastor Elijah. Over the past few weeks, information has come to light that raises significant concerns about his conduct. He detailed the evidence, sparing no detail. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd as the photos and emails were projected onto a screen. When Rachel's testimony was read aloud, the atmosphere shifted from shock to outrage. As the elder concluded, Elijah stood. His face was pale, his usual confident demeanor replaced with something closer to desperation. These accusations are false, he declared, his voice trembling. I have served this community faithfully. This is a coordinated attack to discredit me. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the congregation was no longer willing to be swayed by his words. People began shouting questions, demanding explanations, and calling for his resignation. The scene devolved into chaos, with Elijah eventually storming out of the sanctuary, flanked by a few loyal followers. That evening, the church council announced Elijah's immediate removal as pastor and promised a thorough investigation into his past conduct. It was a small victory, but it felt hollow. The damage to my marriage and my faith in the community was irreparable. As I drove home, I couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and sorrow. The truth was out, but the cost had been high. I had lost the woman I loved, the life I had built, and the trust one once placed in something greater than myself. The days following Elijah's ousting were a whirlwind of emotions and upheaval. The church, once a sanctuary of peace and unity, had become a battlefield of fractured loyalties. Some members clung to Elijah's charismatic persona, convinced he was the victim of a smear campaign. Others, like Peter and myself, were firm in our belief that the truth needed to be confronted, no matter how painful. Evelyn and I existed in a tense limbo. She spent most of her days at home, her face pale and her movements mechanical. I didn't speak to her unless absolutely necessary, and even then, the words felt cold and distant. She didn't try to defend herself anymore. She seemed resigned to the reality of what she had done. One evening, as I sat on the porch staring out at the darkening sky, Evelyn joined me. She stood silently for a moment before speaking. I've been thinking about leaving, she said softly. I turned to look at her, my expression unreadable. Why? Because I don't know how to fix this, she admitted, her voice trembling. I don't know how to make you forgive me. I sighed, the weight of her words pressing down on me. I don't know if I can forgive you, Evelyn. What you did. It's not just about the affair. It's about the lies, the betrayal, the way you destroyed the foundation of what we had. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't try to argue. Instead, she nodded, as if she'd expected my response. I'm sorry, James, she whispered. I'm so sorry. As she walked back into the house, I was left alone with my thoughts. A part of me wanted to hold on to the anger. It was easier than dealing with the pain. But another part, buried deep beneath the hurt, still loved her. Meanwhile, the fallout for Elijah was swift and severe. The church's investigation uncovered even more victims, women who had been too afraid to come forward until now. Their stories painted a chilling picture of a man who had used his charm and position to manipulate and exploit, leaving a trail of broken lives in his wake. Elijah tried to mount a defense, claiming that he was being persecuted for his radical approach to faith. But the evidence was undeniable. and his supporters dwindled. He eventually left town, disappearing as abruptly as he had arrived. For me, the revelations brought a strange sense of closure. Knowing that Elijah had been exposed for what he truly was didn't erase the pain, but it did affirm that I had done the right thing by speaking out. 1 week later, Peter invited me over for dinner. It was a welcome distraction, and I appreciated his unwavering support throughout everything. As we sat in his cozy dining room, he looked at me with a mix of curiosity and concern. "What's next for you, James?" he asked. I shrugged, poking at the food on my plate. "I honestly don't know. Everything feels broken. Sometimes things have to break before they can be rebuilt," he said. "You've been through hell, but you're still standing. That's something." His words stayed with me long after I left his house. They gave me a glimmer of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there's a chance for renewal. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I thought about the life I'd built with Evelyn and whether it was worth salvaging. Could we find a way back to each other? Or was it time to let go and start over? The answers wouldn't come easily, but for the first time in weeks, I felt ready to confront them. The decision wasn't easy, but it came with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. Evelyn and I sat down at the kitchen table the next morning, the same table where we'd shared so many meals, so many moments of joy. This time, though, it felt heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. "I've been thinking about what you said." I began, my voice measured. "About leaving." She looked up at me, her eyes red from sleepless nights. "And I think it's the right choice," I said, the words harder to say than I'd anticipated. "We need time apart. Time to heal, to figure out who we are without each other." Her face crumpled, but she nodded. "I understand. I don't want to hurt you anymore, James." The next few days were a blur of packing and quiet goodbyes. Evelyn decided to stay with her sister in another town, giving us both the space we desperately needed. As she drove away, I stood on the porch, watching her car disappear down the road. It felt like the closing of a chapter, bittersweet and necessary. With Evelyn gone, I turned my attention inward. I started therapy, something I'd resisted for years, thinking I could handle life's challenges on my own. Sitting across from a therapist, I began unpacking not just the betrayal, but the ways I had ignored the cracks in our marriage long before Elijah came into the picture. I also found solace in the community, though the church was no longer the safe haven it once was. I attended smaller gatherings, places where faith felt more genuine, less performative. Slowly, I began to rebuild my sense of spirituality, separate from the institution that had failed me. Evelyn and I remained in contact, but our conversations were brief, focused on logistics rather than emotions. A few months later, she sent me a letter, a long, heartfelt apology where she poured out her guilt, her regret, and her hope that one day I could forgive her. I read the letter several times, my emotions shifting with each pass. Forgiveness was something I wanted to give, not for her, but for myself. Holding on to the anger felt like drinking poison, hoping it would hurt someone else. In time, I wrote her back. "I forgive you," I said, "but forgiveness doesn't mean we can go back to the way things were. It just means I'm letting go of the pain you caused me." It was a small step, but it felt monumental. Months turned into a year, and life slowly began to find a new rhythm. I sold the house, a place filled with too many memories, and moved to a smaller home closer to work. I found joy in simple things again. Saturday mornings at the park, dinners with friends, and quiet evenings with a good book. As for Evelyn, I heard through mutual friends that she was doing better. She'd started attending counseling herself and was working on rebuilding her life. We didn't reconnect romantically, but there was a sense of peace between us, a mutual understanding that we were both moving forward. One Sunday morning, I found myself walking through a different church's doors, a modest building with creaky pews and a welcoming congregation. As the service began, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The pain of the past would always be a part of my story, but it didn't have to define my future. I had learned, through heartbreak and betrayal, that healing wasn't about erasing the scars. It was about learning to live with them, to let them remind you of the strength it took to survive. And in that moment, surrounded by the quiet hum of the choir and the warmth of a new beginning, I finally felt free.